7th grade. As you may notice, a little different setting in the background here, making this video from school for you. I found this interesting, 300 different commodities produced in Washington, but today we're going to talk about economics in Washington. And I tried to address your questions that you put in last week's comments, although not everybody commented. So if you did that late, you need to shoot me an email and let me know. All right, so just talking about North American trade first, somebody asked the question, well, how does most of trade goods move? We talked about ancient civilizations, it was by sea. Well, international trade still primarily moves by sea, 90% of it. Now that said, trade within North America itself is primarily by truck. And so that would be much different than, say, a place like Europe, which is very rail dependent. And believe it or not, barges for canals. And then rail is 14%. In North America by vessel, so going to within U.S. Boundaries from port to port or to Canada or Mexico. Vessels are only 10% within North America, and then 8% pipeline, which is going to be primarily oil, and then 4% plane, 4% other. So early Washington economy, we talked about agriculture, fishing, mining, logging. And you're still going to see, especially agriculture and logging today, some fishing. A lot of the fishing actually occurs up in Alaska with boats stationed out of Washington. And there's some fishing in Washington, but not nearly as much. And mining, mining still happens too, but again, very limited. So somebody had asked about what are evolving jobs. So, the evolving jobs are going from these old industries. So again, this agriculture, fishing, mining, logging. And if you look at these sectors over here, you've got aerospace, military. So that JBLM is a Joint Base Lewis McChord. And so that covers a whole slew of different jobs. So military doesn't really give you very many specifics, but there's the hospital there. So there's some healthcare. There's facilities maintenance. There's support, logistics support. There's a lot of different jobs there. Amazon, so technology, originally it was retail primarily just with books, but they do a lot of technical services now. So Microsoft, again, tech, UW education, and quite a bit of medical facilities and jobs. Providence, and again, this is Washington. This is 1 through 8 in Washington State. And then you see those last two retail there. So I just bring this up because, not to belittle any of those other industries, but, when you start talking agriculture or logging or mining, there is skill involved. So I don't mean to say that it's unskilled and that, you don't, do better if you know your job better. But it is much simpler to show up and say, I want to work on a farm than it is to show up at Boeing and say, I want to design airplanes, right? And so when we say skilled versus unskilled, we're usually talking about, education beyond high school. So that said, there still are 100,000 agricultural workers still today in Washington. And, I mentioned Weyerhaeuser there with 10,000 employees because, logging still occurs in this state, primarily in Southwest Washington, actually. And then, as I mentioned before, education is going to be a big factor in these evolving jobs. And so as jobs change, education becomes more important to get these new jobs that are developing in Washington State. So several people ask, well, if creative destruction is so important, why don't we study it? Well, okay, fair enough, but it's just something that happens. Like we're actually, and I'll talk about this in the COVID slide, we're going through a little bit of that right now. So under the process of creative destruction, one of the sort of the antithesis of that would be a monopoly or a trust. And so somebody asked, can you cheat supply and demand? And well, there was a case against Microsoft in 1998 where they were bundling everything together. They were bundling their software, their operating system, their web browser. And so when you bought a computer, you had all these programs and all of this content in your computer when you bought it. And so there was some argument about it was squeezing out other, for example, web browsers. At the time they had Netscape and Opera. And I think you could make a very valid argument. Well, if they were that much better, people would have went ahead and downloaded, which is what people do today. Like I download Chrome as soon as I get a new computer. But that was a case where it was portrayed and seen to some degree as cheating the supply and demand. And you do that by gaining a monopoly on a market. I don't think this really applied in Microsoft's case, but it is interesting in that it is out of Washington and it is dealing with this idea. Apple, talking about creative destruction, 2000, when all this was going on with Microsoft, Apple picked up a big portion of the computer business. Although, as you can see in this graph here, computers became less and less important to Apple, and eventually the iPhones became important. So, in other words, on the front end of this, around 2000, Apple's taking advantage of creative destruction within the PC market, the computer market, to sort of insert itself and provide a product that's seen as a higher quality product. But then Apple itself evolves and becomes more interested in the iPhone and portable electronics. Amazon's another good example here in Washington. It starts out as a bookstore. Kathleen actually wrote a paper on this, and then they blossomed into this mega retailer. They're into groceries now. As I mentioned before, they do online services like with routers and cloud storage and even technical service for companies. And then Walmart is another innovator, not based out of Washington, but one of the top 8, as you saw, employers in Washington. And again, they're always kind of on the cutting edge of a retail store, combining groceries with their other products, and also not necessarily a pioneer in the online business, but sort of the first brick and mortar to really move heavily into online. Somebody asked about, if China isn't capitalist, can we trade with them? It's like, yeah, definitely. So, you constantly hear about trade war between U.S. and China, and years before this, it was, China was communist, and they're not going to trade. And there's always a difference between the rhetoric, what people say, and then what people do, which is to actually trade. This top chart here, if you look at it, it's you combine those imports and exports between China and the U.S., and you're talking over $500 billion worth of trade taking place to and from China. Although if you notice, there's the trade deficit. You hear people talk about this too. We're importing more from China than they're taking from us in exports, and then there's a lot of reasons for that. And I'm not going to get into that right now, but it is an interesting argument that goes back and forth. So Washington obviously has a strong Pacific trade connection, being on the Pacific Ocean. If you look down on this next chart, $77 billion worth of exports. Well, 18 billion of that goes to China. And then also, Japan and Korea being in the Pacific as well. Washington is very heavily tied to Pacific markets. And even Canada, you could argue, is Pacific, right? Because a lot of that trade is happening with British Columbia. And then, again, this idea of evolving jobs, Washington is sending out transportation equipment, computer and electronic products, machinery. So these are all things that are part of that sort of evolving economy. Washington getting away from just sending out raw materials, which would be your agricultural products and to some degree your processed foods there. So COVID-19, what kind of impact is it going to have? Top chart there, talking about the U.S. economy, first quarter of 2020, dropped by 5%. And that's going to be your GDP, your gross domestic product, basically a giant estimated calculator of the economy and how much money is generated in this country. So as you can see, this is worse than even 2008, which was, dubbed as the Great Recession. So that first quarter was even worse than, that tail end of the Great Recession there. So it's going to have some immediate impacts, right, that are obvious. There's going to be this reopening and this recovery. And, the bottom one shows unemployment claims in Washington state. Well, what is that going to look like in 2 months? Does COVID come back? Do we take another rise in unemployment and a lowering in the economy? And this idea of creative destruction exists. You notice there's a lot of companies filing for bankruptcy right now across the country. And what you're finding is a lot of those companies were in trouble to begin with. And so this is just sort of speeding that process. I'm not saying that it's ideal that it's happening, that it's a good thing it's happening, but I am saying that this idea of creative destruction and sort of tearing down ways of doing things and figuring out new ways to do things is being accelerated by COVID-19 right now. So what's your role in Washington economy? I love this cartoon, saw it a couple weeks ago. Congrats, the future is yours to the graduates, presumably college graduates. But what is your role in Washington economy, or if you move outside of the state, in the United States economy? You've seen what some of those jobs are that exist in Washington. And it always becomes a matter of balancing things like your personal interests. I've never had a job that I hated. I certainly liked some more than others. I can't imagine coming to work every day for a job I hate. This is by far my favorite job, and I love coming to work. And I miss not seeing you guys here every day, and I miss you guys over the summer. So, for me, this is a great fit. And what are your strengths? Now, you could argue that my strengths don't lie necessarily in teaching. I don't know, but you probably shouldn't do something that you're absolutely horrible at, right? And then what societal impacts, like can you make a difference, whether it's socially, whether it's environmentally, scientifically. And I don't mean to belittle any other job that's out there that's necessary to the daily functioning of society, but I do think it's important to think about your job and what impacts it has. All right, so that was pretty quick. I know I talked fast. I was trying not to make this too long. There's a lot you can ask about, the economy and Washington's economy specifically. So I guess at the end of this, what I'm looking for is any questions you have based off of this presentation. And so not only a question that you have about this presentation, but I'm also interested, what do you see your role in the Washington economy being? We had a really good discussion in the Color of My Words about, your future, and some kids were like, hey, chill out, relax, like we got time. And some kids were like, you got to be thinking about it. So it was fun to read, but I'm not asking you to decide your life right now, but I'm just curious, going into 8th grade, you're a teenager, what do you think maybe your role would be in the economy, Washington, US, world, whatever it may be. So I'd be interested to hear that. So again, question about the presentation and then what you see your role in the Washington economy being. And if you'd like, 198, 199 in your Washington Journey book, I think has some good reading. It's about entrepreneurs, so people who created companies in Washington State. And it doesn't go in depth, but it covers, several entrepreneurs, and it's always interesting to kind of read that history. All right, talked for a while there. Go ahead and post in the comments, and there will be a Padlet tomorrow. All right, take care. Bye.